You're standing in a corridor that smells of expensive incense and fear. The marble beneath your sandals is cold, polished smooth by generations of imperial feet, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, beyond the flickering oil lamps, the Empress is waiting. You don't know why she summoned you. You only know that when powerful people notice you exist, survival becomes suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. Now pull back from that moment and consider what it meant to be noticed by Valeria Messalina in the year 48 CE. To receive her attention was to step into a world where beauty became weaponized, where political power and physical desire merged into something neither Roman law nor social custom had words to contain. She was 28 years old. She had been Empress of Rome for 7 years, and in those 7 years, she had transformed the imperial court into a place where the rules governing ordinary human behavior simply ceased to apply. Before we go further into this story, I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching this from. Drop a comment below, because it amazes me how a scandal from 2,000 years ago still captivates people across every continent today. The historical record on Messalina presents us with a paradox. Multiple independent sources: Tacitus, drawing on eyewitness accounts; Suetonius, working from imperial archives; Cassius Dio, synthesizing earlier histories; even the satirist Juvenal, whose poetry assumed his audience, already knew the stories all describe behavior so extreme it seems designed to test the boundaries of credibility. We should be skeptical. Ancient historians routinely weaponized sexual accusations against powerful women. But the consistency across sources, the specific details that survive, the political consequences that followed these, suggest something extraordinary actually happened, something that pushed beyond scandal into territory Rome had never encountered before. Messalina was born around 20 CE into the apex of Roman aristocracy. Her family tree connected directly to Augustus through multiple branches. She grew up in homes where marble columns rose 3 stories high, where slave musicians played during meals that lasted hours, where political conspiracy was background noise as constant as the fountain water in the courtyards. At 18, she was married to Tiberius Claudius, a 50-year-old scholar with a stutter and a limp, whom nobody expected would ever amount to anything politically. His own mother had called him unfinished, a cruel assessment of his physical disabilities that made him seem unsuitable for public life in a culture obsessed with martial perfection. For 3 years, Messalina lived the expected life of an aristocratic Roman wife. She bore 2 children, Octavia and Britannicus. She managed households. She attended social functions. Then, on January 24th, in the year 41, the Emperor Caligula was assassinated by his own guards, and everything changed in a single afternoon of blood and political chaos. The Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a palace curtain, terrified he was about to be executed. Instead, they proclaimed him emperor not because he was qualified, but because he was perfect, precisely due to his harmlessness. He had no political base, no military following, no history of making dangerous enemies. His legitimacy through bloodline was unquestionable. The Senate, confronted with armed soldiers and a fait accompli, confirmed him. And suddenly, the 19-year-old wife of a marginalized scholar became Empress of Rome. What Messalina discovered in those first months of power must have been intoxicating beyond anything her privileged upbringing had prepared her for. She found that her beauty and intelligence, combined with imperial position, gave her influence over decisions affecting millions of people across 3 continents. She discovered that her husband, brilliant in his scholarship, but remarkably naive about human manipulation, could be guided. Through careful timing, through tears deployed strategically, through the association of agreement with physical affection and comfort. She learned that the palace freedmen who actually ran the imperial bureaucracy, former slaves, now wielding enormous unofficial power, would cooperate with her when it served their interests or when opposing. Her seemed more dangerous than accommodation. Within a year, Messalina had established herself as a force that Rome's political class recognized and feared. People seeking imperial favor learned to cultivate the empress. Officials wanting appointments sought her support. And people who crossed her learned how swiftly and completely she could destroy them. But according to every ancient source that mentions her, Messalina's ambitions extended far beyond conventional political influence. The historians describe appetites that seem to require transgression itself, as much as any specific physical satisfaction. They name senators, actors, gladiators, even palace slaves among her companions, men spanning the entire Roman social hierarchy, from the most distinguished citizens to people with essentially no legal rights. The sheer scope suggested compulsion rather than simple desire. A psychology that needed conquest and variety and the thrill of violating boundaries. More disturbing than the number of relationships was how Messalina weaponized intimacy for political control. She would seduce senators who opposed her initiatives, then use their complicity, their technical treason, in violating the empresses. Marriage as leverage to transform them into tools bound to her through shared guilt. The case of Suilius Caseninus illustrates this perfectly. He initially voted against measures she favored, spoke eloquently about senatorial independence from excessive imperial influence. Then Messalina targeted him deliberately, arranged opportunities for private encounters, deployed all her considerable charm. Afterward, his behavior changed completely. He became one of her most reliable supporters, voting as she directed through intermediaries, because he understood that if he crossed her, she could reveal their relationship and destroy everything: his position, his family's fortune, his life. Sometimes the coercion was even more direct. The famous actor Mester reportedly tried to refuse her advances, understanding that a relationship with the empress would make him the subject of mockery. Throughout Rome, despite his popularity on stage, according to the sources, Messalina convinced Claudius to order Nestor to obey the empress in all things. And Claudius issued this command without understanding. It would be used to force the actor into an intimate relationship. Once trapped, Nestor's association with Messalina became Rome's worst-kept secret, destroying his reputation while Claudius remained apparently oblivious. Perhaps most calculated was Messalina's strategy of targeting the husbands of women who had insulted her. She would seduce the man, then ensure the wife discovered the betrayal in the most humiliating way possible. A word dropped at a dinner party, a letter left where it would be found, an arranged encounter where the wife would walk in on something unmistakable. For aristocratic Roman women, this represented social annihilation. Then Messalina would often complete the destruction by having the husband accused of treason, using fabricated evidence to arrange his execution or exile while the wife was left impoverished and alone. The story of Valerius Asiaticus exposes the full extent of Messalina's ruthless cunning. Asiaticus was a senator of immense prestige, twice consul, owner of vast estates, and possessor of the gardens of Lucullus, one of Rome's most exquisite private properties with breathtaking views from the Pincian Hill. Messalina coveted those gardens. To claim them, she orchestrated a meticulous plot, enlisting compromised senators to fabricate charges of conspiracy. Witnesses were coached, letters were forged implying secret collusion with military commanders, and financial records were altered to suggest he was amassing bribes for soldiers. The trial was not held in the Senate, but in Claudius's bedchamber, with Messalina watching closely. Asiaticus mounted a powerful defense, exposing inconsistencies, the lack of motive, and the absurdity of the accusations. For a brief moment it seemed reason might prevail. Then Messalina broke into tears, framing herself as a betrayed friend and appealing to Claudius's emotions rather than law or logic. Overcome with concern for his wife and unable to believe she could lie, Claudius condemned Asiaticus to death. He was allowed to commit suicide, preserving some of his estate, and he chose to die in the gardens of Lucullus, dignified to the last. Within days, Messalina seized the gardens for herself, showing no shame or regret. This pattern repeated relentlessly. Decius Calpurnianus fell because Messalina desired his estates. Poppaeus Rufinus died over a personal slight to the empress. Troilus Montanus was executed for spurning her. Fear became pervasive. Senators greeted their children each morning, unsure they would see them alive at night. Claudius, intelligent yet blinded by lifelong self-doubt, and manipulated by his wife's charm and flattery, remained complicit, unable or unwilling to perceive her machinations. For 7 years, Messalina's power went unchecked, until in the autumn of 48 CE she committed an audacious act, marrying Gaius Silius in full public ceremony while still legally wed to Claudius, an act that finally triggered Narcissus to intervene and bring her deadly reign crashing to an end. Messalina, learning what was happening, fled to the gardens of Lucullus, those same gardens she had stolen from Valerius. Asiaticus, through her fabricated treason charges, which now became the setting for her final hours. She was there with her mother Lepida and her 2 young children. The sources describe her alternating between panic and denial. Unable to process that everything had collapsed so completely, she tried drafting letters to Claudius, begging for mercy, trying to explain the wedding as a misunderstanding. She apparently still believed that if she could just get face-to-face with him one more time, she could use her skills of manipulation to make him forgive her. But Narcissus understood perfectly that Messalina could never be allowed near Claudius again. If they met, if she had a chance to work her usual psychological manipulations, there was a real possibility that Claudius would spare her. And if Messalina survived, she would take revenge on everyone who had moved against her. She had to be eliminated before Claudius could reconsider. Narcissus sent a tribune named Evotus with unambiguous orders: ensure Messalina died, either by her own hand or by his. When Evotus arrived at the gardens with soldiers, he found Messalina with her mother. According to Tacitus's detailed account, Lepida, who had been estranged from her daughter for years because she disapproved of Messalina's behavior, was now trying to convince her to die with dignity, to take her own life in the traditional Roman fashion, and preserve at least some shred of honor for her children. In Roman culture, choosing suicide rather than execution was considered noble under certain circumstances. It meant dying as a free Roman, making your own final decision, rather than as a convict being executed by the state. It also meant that some property could pass to your children rather than being entirely confiscated. Lepida was offering her daughter this final mercy, but Messalina couldn't do it. She picked up the dagger her mother provided, held it in shaking hands, brought it toward her throat, but she couldn't complete the act. She had spent her entire adult life getting what she wanted through charm and threats and manipulation, never really believing there were situations where her usual strategies wouldn't work. Now, faced with an unmanipulable reality where all her abilities were useless, she was psychologically paralyzed. Evotus, watching this scene for several long moments and following his orders from Narcissus, finally stepped forward and killed her himself with his sword. Messalina died there in the gardens at age 28, killed by a mid-ranking military officer following orders from a former slave. Her extraordinary life ended in a place she had acquired through murder. Claudius was informed that Messalina was dead while he was at dinner that evening. According to Suetonius, he showed no particular emotion. He didn't weep or express grief or anger or relief. He didn't ask how she had died or whether she had said anything final. He simply continued eating, called for more wine, and never mentioned her name again that evening or apparently ever afterward. The woman he had been married to for 10 years, the mother of his children, simply ceased to exist for him. The Senate ordered a damnatio memoria, a formal condemnation of memory. Messalina's name was to be erased from public inscriptions. Statues were to be removed or defaced. Official records were to be altered to minimize her role when possible. The goal was to obliterate her from history, to make it as though she had never been empress. But of course, the attempt failed completely. The story was too sensational, the scandals too shocking, the arc of her life too perfect as a morality tale about power and corruption for it to be forgotten. Instead of fading from memory, Messalina's story was preserved in extensive detail by historians who recorded everything they could learn. Poets made her the ultimate symbol of depravity and corrupt power. Her name entered common usage as a synonym for insatiable appetite and moral corruption. Even now, 2,000 years after her death, Messalina remains recognizable to educated people as representing the ultimate example of power, corrupted through unrestrained ambition and desire. What should we make of her across 2 millennia of distance? We need to acknowledge the limitations and biases of our sources, ancient historians writing for male audiences within deeply misogynistic cultural frameworks. Accusations of inappropriate intimate behavior were standard tools for discrediting powerful women. So we should maintain appropriate skepticism of the most extreme claims. The specific numbers were probably exaggerated. The visits to houses of ill repute, described by Juvenal, were probably invented or heavily embellished by a satirist looking for maximum shock value. But even accounting generously for exaggeration and bias, a disturbing core remains that cannot be dismissed. Multiple independent sources corroborate that Messalina had numerous relationships used as political weapons, that she orchestrated deaths of people who threatened her position or possessed things she wanted. The marriage to Silius actually happened. There were too many witnesses for it to have been invented, and the consequences were too immediate for it to have been fabrication. What we're left with is a portrait of someone whose combination of youth, beauty, intelligence, political power, and complete lack of accountability created a perfect storm of transgressive behavior. Messalina discovered at 19 that she had access to nearly unlimited resources, that she could influence an insecure emperor eager to please her. She learned that consequences were for other people, not for her. And she pushed boundaries progressively further over 7 years, testing limits, discovering that limits barely existed for someone in her position. Each transgression that went unpunished emboldened the next one. Each successful manipulation made the next seem easier. Each person she destroyed with impunity made the next destruction seem more justified or at least more feasible. She spiraled into increasingly extreme behavior driven by appetites that seemed insatiable, by a psychological need for transgression that became as powerful as any physical desire, by the corruption that absolute power invariably produces when combined with youth and lack of preparation. She left behind 2 young children who would bear the taint of their mother's reputation for tragically short lives. Britannicus would be poisoned at age 14, almost certainly murdered by Nero to eliminate a potential rival. Octavia would be forced to marry Nero, treated with contempt throughout the marriage, eventually exiled on false charges, and executed at 22. A catastrophe, their lives destroyed by their mother's actions in ways that demonstrate how consequences of corruption extend across generations. She left behind dozens, if not hundreds, of destroyed lives, families ruined by her political machinations, men compromised by her manipulations, women humiliated by her cruelty. Each represented a personal tragedy that historical sources record only briefly, if at all, because ancient historians focused on the powerful rather than on their victims. And she left behind questions that still resonate powerfully today. What happens when power is divorced from restraint? When individual appetite is freed from social constraint? When intelligence and ambition are channeled entirely into self-gratification without regard for others? The answer embodied in Messalina's story is that such a person becomes something beyond normal human boundaries, so destructive that they must eventually be eliminated to protect others. The ruins of imperial Rome still stand as tourist destinations visited by millions who walk the same ground where Messalina schemed and destroyed. The Palatine Hill where the palace stood, the Forum where senators whispered about her scandals and feared becoming her next target. The gardens of Lucullus where she died, now buried under modern Rome, but once the setting for her final hours. These places remember, even if most crowds walking through them don't know the full story. When that tribune's sword struck her down in those stolen gardens, it ended one of the most extraordinary lives in Roman history. But the patterns she exemplified, the corruption of power, the weaponization of intimacy for political purposes, the destruction of lives for personal gratification, these patterns did not die with her 2,000 years ago. They appear throughout history in different forms, with the same underlying dynamics. Understanding Messalina helps us recognize those patterns when they appear, helps us understand how power corrupts and how societies enable that corruption, helps us see the human cost of systems that give some people unlimited power over others without accountability or restraint. Remember her not as she wanted to be remembered as empress and power broker controlling an empire, but as history has remembered her as the ultimate cautionary tale about power without restraint, about intelligence divorced from empathy, about how even the most privileged person can spiral into self-destruction when all limits are removed and all accountability disappears. The teenage bride who became empress transformed herself into myth even while alive, into a story that has resonated across 2 millennia and continues to fascinate and disturb us, because it reveals uncomfortable truths about what we're all capable of becoming when nothing and no one can tell us no.